Yes. Oh, Valerie's nice black and white. Yeah, black and white.
Yeah, I don't know the reason, but yeah, it is what it is. Yeah,
Nice
maybe.
Snapchat filter.
Yeah, like in noir movie or something.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's over a week ago we had a design session with the NUTS technical team on what to do with credentials, authorization credentials that are issued by a single vendor, usable by multiple vendors, also at a different source. If you have two vendors from the same care organizations, then it shouldn't matter for a specific use case which one of the which one of the vendors issued the authorization credential. We also talked about where does the logical identifier fit in, and how does this relate to the technical identifier. So Jari is joining. So I wrote some stuff down on our wiki. I'll share it with you guys. Welcome, Jari.
Hi.
Share screen. I have lots of screens. Where is it? This one. Okay. So these are the notes from our technical discussion. Basically, what it comes down to is that we would prefer to keep issuing the authorization credentials to the DoD. So the credential subject dot identifier will still be the DID. To prevent some really nasty things. And the idea is that the NUTS nodes themselves, so the software, they will detect when logical identifiers are bound to a DoD. So for example, in the let's see, in this scope, if one of the two vendors on the right adds a organization credential with a logical identifier to one of its DIDs, it's automatically detected by the NUTS node on the left, bottom left, and it will automatically issue a second authorization credential based on the presence of that logical identifier in the network. So the authorization.
So that's public?
Yeah, so what will happen, and we also designed a flow, OpenID Connect flow on how your server-side wallet will receive credentials, for example, from the LRZA. And once you receive a credential in your wallet, which is out of band of the NUTS network, you will publish a presentation of this because you want to be found with that logical identifier and with the name of the organization that is attached to it. And the publication of this presentation is picked up by all the nodes. And because of the special type of those organization credentials, because it has logical identifiers, nodes will going to act on it. So if there's an active registration, for example, that a specific logical identifier is required to receive an authorization credential, the NUTS nodes will handle that for you. So basically what it will boil down to is that you activate or deactivate a certain authorization profile on your NUTS node. Any other DID in a network that matches that profile, for example, on logical identifier, will receive a specific authorization credential.
I remember last time we discussed something along the lines of filling in the logical identifier in that subject ID field, so that you can use the same authorization credential for any new organization that would be created with that logical identifier. But this is the opposite of that idea, right? This is
the other option, the alternative. Because revocation becomes simpler. So if one credential is deactivated or revoked for that specific DID, you can search on all the credentials issued to that DID. Otherwise, you need a separate administration for that as well, and becomes a bit.
That is true, but you have introduced more syncing related issues. So suddenly there's a responsibility for a node to listen in the network for how would you say, new organization credentials, I guess, and then issue new authorization credentials as a response to that.
So the node already listens to several things, for example, DID document updates, and acts on that as well. So that's not totally new. The main reason to do this is that when requesting an access token, you can keep the same mechanism. So you don't have to add additional organization credentials in the request access token flow. You also don't have to search for a combination of authorization credentials and organization credentials when you want to make a request access token flow. So
exactly, that all stays the same, and that's nice. I'm very worried about how chatty this will be, and also about how dependent this will be that every other node in the network is listening at the time of issuing, for example, an authorization credential. Like it's just a general syncing issue, if you have a dependency that a node in the network has to take action if another credential has been issued, that's it kind of feels like there are more spots where that can go wrong. You understand where I'm coming from?
We don't think it's an issue because right now you're highly dependent on organization credentials being synchronized between all the nodes, because you can't find any care organization if you don't have those credentials.
That's definitely true. Yeah, no, synchronizing is already something that happens like event-based if there's another document updated. But this is something new because this is issuing a new credential as a response automatically. We haven't done that before.
No, but we're quite confident that it won't be a problem.
Okay.
So that's the basics. It's the best backwards compatible option because actually I think for vendors the only thing that will change is how you call the API to create an authorization credential. That would probably be something like activate an authorization profile if you want to do it for a certain logical identifier.
I'm sorry to keep hammering on this, but is it the right is it the right strategy to this early in the NUTS project to already focus so much on backwards compatibility? Because we're all very how would you say, young, very very new to NUTS anyway. There's a lot of implementation that we need to do anyway. The focus on backwards compatibility, I get it, but isn't it worth it to make some changes that are not backwards compatible and then have a migration path for those that are implementing it?
If there's a very good reason to do so, then yes. But if you look at all the technical consequences, for example, searching for a combination of credentials that give access to a certain use case is also not a very simple technical solution for. Because basically what you're doing right now is just give me all the authorization credentials for this use case and this patient. That will change into give me a combination of credentials that will give access to this patient and this use case. And then there are some logical rules that have to be built in that combine certain credentials. And this is a big nuisance because those credentials are JSON linked data, which is very poorly supported by off-the-shelf databases. So your performance will be down the drain because you have to do multiple joins with databases that do not support joins. So that's a pretty nasty problem, which is not doable on the short term. So we're also looking into how can we support this with fairly minimal effort. And then it's also pretty easily implemented by all the vendors. Regarding backwards compatibility, we already see that there are vendors that are behind a lot of months on deployment. And this will not become better. It will probably become worse.
True. Yeah. Well, what I'm kind of worried that a little while ago, Nuts might have gone into a path of architectural decisions that makes it quite hard to implement this multiple vendor feature thing that we would like. And that makes it quite hard to make a jump to another architectural path. And for good reasons, you guys went into that path. So that totally makes sense. But if we, I feel that maybe if we think outside of the box a bit more, so outside of the way that Nuts has currently been doing it with linked data and verifiable credentials, etc., that we might find a solution that's more simple and maybe more elegant. But so my question is that something that the Nuts community is interested in? I'm not saying replace verifiable credentials completely or anything like that. I'm just saying maybe we should think a little bit out of the box and see what else in terms of technology is out there that can help us with fixing this issue.
But do we have any specific ideas?
Well, I'm thinking like a messaging system could be very interesting. So instead of having credentials that are issued, signed, and shared with linked data, like a messaging system where other Nuts nodes hook onto, and then they send messages to each other that can be signed and encrypted, and maybe even linked data. But that way you would have like a messaging bus that makes it a lot easier, or I think it might make it a lot easier to share messages across a whole network where anyone can be listening to them. And those messages could be things like the authorization has been given or authorization has been revoked, or stuff like that. That's just like one idea, a messaging system like solution. There might be some other ones out there as well that I would like to collect as a Nuts community.
I think you have to keep in mind to separate the different layers of architecture, because currently there is a messaging system, which are the transactions, which are signed. So you have signed messages. So a message bus is just a transport layer. So the question is, what are you going to put on that transport layer, what is the contents of those messages?
Yeah.
Are then usable by the other side, and currently that are the verifiable credentials.
Yeah.
It's a signed message where you get a signed receipt of something you can do.
Yeah.
So basically,
okay. Yeah.
that system is there. The problem we have here is that you want to know who to send messages to, and I can imagine that you as a vendor, you just want to say, I want to send messages to everything, every system regarding that single care organization. And then it should be
in most use cases, yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I'm actually proposing. So what you are going to do on the API is just say, this care organization is authorized to do this, and then software handles it for you.
Okay. So maybe then we might just be closer to that than I thought we were. I'm thinking, is there a way to build that so that you don't have to issue new? I don't know if it's issuing credentials or presentations in this system. I guess presentations because they are shared with other parties. But having to issue those new verifiable presentations each time, I guess that's a dependency. If a node isn't listening for some time, that might be a bit of a risk. Is there a way to do this with the messaging system that's already in place that doesn't make you issue new presentations or credentials? I don't know which one is which. Is there a way to do that? Or are we going to build it into the NUTS core so that it's not the responsibility of the vendor to do that syncing work, just like the transaction system is already in place?
Yes, so that's what I'm actually proposing.
Okay. So it'll be fully
handled. It's handled transparently for you as a vendor.
Yeah.
And the basics behind it is that credentials, they live in a wallet, so they are attached to key material. So that is the basics. And if you attach it to a logical identifier, we're going down a path that nobody else does. And then it becomes, we can get it to work, but it will not be compatible with what the rest of the world is doing.
Okay, let's follow this path and see where it takes us. But I want to keep the option open that if that gives us too much trouble, we can at least try the option with the logical identifier, so that we can weigh the pros and cons of both when we come to a final decision.
Yes.
Just a bit worried that this creates a system with a lot of vulnerabilities, I guess.
I think on the
you say that you've outweighed the pros and the cons, and you say no, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine, and then I'll believe that. It's just I have that worry that it might be too chatty of a system at some point because of that.
So you're worried about too many messages going around?
Yeah, so that's one thing. So like I said, the too many messages, and that it's a little bit too fragile because of that, because there's a dependency that everyone is listening at the time of a new authorization credential being issued, so that they can issue their own credential presentation based on that dependency. I don't really. It would be very nice to have each vendor be able to issue authorization credentials for the business organization in such a way that with one issuing of a credential, it's valid for each of the other vendors in the network, which you would have with the logical ID part, which of course has its own disadvantages. But yeah, that's I feel it would be more elegant to have a solution like that.
Yeah. So one of the basic design principles we're now taking is credentials are supposed to be in a wallet. And when issuing credentials, they must be issued to a wallet. because that's how the entire world is working with verifiable credentials. So publishing verifiable credentials so everybody can store them for later use would be against the general idea of verifiable credentials and wallets in general. I understand your worries, but if you look at what the NUTS nodes are doing right now, is synchronizing a lot of data. So, for example, the DRD documents are also synchronized between all the nodes. So every key update, service update, etc., is already using the same messaging system.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Like we said, Nuts is already doing that. The transactions are already synced in that way. Just issuing credentials is new, but maybe that's a lot smaller of a step than I thought it would be.
Yeah, so the logic will just be in a single node,
yeah.
And then it will reuse the publication of credentials to other wallets. So instead of doing it once, it will do it twice, for example. So instead of issuing it to a single DRD, it will issue it to 2 DRDs or 3. And only when it's the use case that a new vendor arrives, then it has to monitor what is happening on the network and act on it. So that will be like, yeah, maybe somewhere in the future. But the base case would be there are multiple vendors for a care organization, and at the time of issuing, it will just do a for each, and then create a new authorization credential for each of those DIDs. That will be the 99% use case. Okay, so the other way around, it's a bit more complex, because when requesting an access token, the NUTS node will also have to look into the relations between DIDs based on logical identifiers. So the access token logic in the NUTS node will become a bit more complex.
Yes, because you need to add that additional credential that binds the DID to the logical identifier, right? In your access token.
So basically what we're going to do internally in the NUTS node is instead of focusing everything around a DID and a DID document, we'll actually say, okay, so we have an identity and an entity, and this entity has multiple identifiers.
Yes.
One of the identifiers is your own DID because you created it, so you can trust it. Another one could be the logical identifier because it comes from a trusted source. And then if another DID is also connected to that logical identifier, then it's actually an alias for your DID. And that way you can create, build up your entity with multiple identifiers.
Yeah.
And then the access token endpoint has to check that as well. So that's a bit more work, but having to deal with logical identifiers actually also means, and I think I have this in the wiki concept of logical identifier. So logical identifier will become a concept within the NUTS node and within the specifications. So it's not like we have a property in a verifiable credential, it's an actual special property. So we also have to identify, which will partly go into the configuration, I guess, is which specific credentials trusted by specific parties have logical identifiers in them. Because it will be a very important concept. Yeah, so we'll say, okay, it needs to be configurable. We'll probably add some hard-coded configuration for the first instances. For example, if we're going to do something with the LSZA, then we have to come up with the specific credential type that the LSZA is issuing. And then that has to be configured. And of course, it could also be a different source. It doesn't have to be a DID NUTS issuer. It could also be a DID web issuer or a DID or a X509 based issuer. So that's all configuration we have to add to the node. But that's actually the same as you do now, because now you have to place a check mark for each NUTS DID you trust. And basically then it's the same. So who do you trust on issuing logical identifiers?
Yep.
Yeah, so authorization registry. So this is what I talked about, the authorization registry. So for example, if you currently have the API where you say, okay, create this authorization credential from this DID to this DID with this contents. It will be slightly different where you say, okay, create this authorization credential for this logical identifier from this logical identifier or from this DID. And then instead of actually issuing a authorization credential directly, it will update its own registry, issue credentials from there, and react on any changes in the network and start revoking or automatically issuing new authorization credentials. So that's acting on new logical identifiers. And of course, revocation. So this is also something that has to be discussed with any official issuer of logical identifiers. How are they going to issue revocations, and how are the nodes automatically going to react to those notifications? And then we had the thing we discussed on scoping and purpose of use. This is yeah, so this can just stay in the current authorization credential. We also talked about how are we going to determine which vendor is capable of acting in a certain use case or certain purpose of use or scoping, how you want to call it. And this is closely tied with some plans for also separating the actual data you get from all the nodes. Are you getting data from all the nodes or just the nodes that you share use cases with? We envisioned that maybe, for example, we can create a simple piece of software, and then NICTIS could just authorize different vendors that they participate in certain use cases, or a different authority actually acknowledges these vendors are active in different use cases, and then you could probably enforce it with a credential. I don't know if we have to do this for the as the first step, because we don't have those authorities yet, and then we are our own authority. So it would be an interesting thing to explore. The bootstrap phase will most likely do something the same as we do now. Who do you trust?
Yeah, but isn't it kind of part of the core of NUTS that we let the market come up with their own use cases as opposed to top-down NICTIS enforcement?
Yeah, but there might be a difference in acceptance. So you might say, I don't care who's on the other end. There might be some vendors that do care. So the stories should be correct. The most simple use cases, they probably don't enforce anything. And we'll also have to
right, but maybe
what will happen. Let's see, what else did I write down? Qualified to serve as a use case. Should be a use case authority. That could perform the role of issuing a scope credential. And then there's a small area I wrote down here with a possible roadmap. Using Kafka and link to vendor scope to logical identifier. That's getting an actual logical identifier. Host authority software. That would be how to officially get official scope like credentials, and don't let anybody in that use case if you do not want to. It according to the trust over IP model, this is actually correct. I think in practice, like you said, Edwin, it will take a long time, if it will even be the case. Yeah, so it's a pretty complicated question. It's all about trust, right? So if you want to get automated trust between vendors for specific use cases, then you need something like this. Otherwise, you have to do manual trust, which is already there. So manual trust will always be the backup, because otherwise we also, it's pretty hard to create our software, build our software, because all testing and demos and development network and test network use peer-to-peer trust, and not official trusted authorities.
So the trust alternative here would be kind of the same as it is now. You have to trust each node, or on a different level.
Yeah, so now you see that you can trust certain parties for those organization credentials, for example, or certain credentials. That would still be the same, but you want to know who you can trust for the logical identifiers, but you also need to know who can you trust for issuing authorization credentials that you did not issue. You already see that in the API, there's something like this, because you have this flag where you can say, okay, I want untrusted credentials.
Right, so it's still at the level of vendor, not at the level of I trust all identifiers.
No, so it's currently it's still on the vendor level. This would still make sure that you can start quickly with use cases. It just doesn't create the really open network you want, because if vendors don't like each other, then there's a problem. But it might just not be a problem for the next 5 years. That could also be the case.
True. And did you discuss who would create this authority software, being nuts, or is it part of vendors?
So the community will do it. So if there's a need, we'll probably spend some time on it, just like we did on the registry admin demo, just to get stuff started and give everybody a feel how it should be used. It could also be the case that in use cases where multiple vendors are active, that those vendors get peer-to-peer trust, and they say, oh, this is sufficient to go ahead, and maybe one vendor a year is added or something, and then there's a group of 5 or 6 vendors or so. So if everybody is still fine with that, you see that the foundation can also be part of this and publish, for example, the role of the list of vendors that signed the agreement and in which use case they are active. And then there's just an overview of it at a central place where you can say, okay, this gives a nice overview. I might check this on Slack or by email or whatever. But right now, I think Slack is the official medium to get trusted by each other, which is, of course, a bit dodgy.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the basic idea. We can create designs of this, and we can actually implement this and see how this will function. There's one additional problem which was also brought up by Taco Jan, which is a bit sad he isn't here, which is about the actual contents of an authorization credential. So I'm going to find an example. So I would like to get your input. We still have 23 minutes left, which is about the listed file resources you are allowed to access, because those are relative paths and they are now tied to the issuer and then the endpoint, and then you know what to fetch. But if those resources are scattered around different vendors, it becomes a bit more problematic. So maybe to make my point, I'm going to find an example of an authorization credential. And loads of those. Authorization credential. Yeah. Share it again. Yeah, this one. So the challenge, and it might be something specific for e-overdracht, but Edwin Jari, you may join in. And currently the problem is here. From what I understood from Taco Jan, he says, okay, we're a best of breed solution. There might be 3 systems involved for providing these resources. For example, here it says /document reference, but the /patient might come from a different system. How would that work? Would, for example, everybody would get the same authorization credential with all the resources listed, and they could try to fetch it at the different systems, but because there are UIDs here, and then that becomes very, very iffy. Because there are UIDs, other systems would not be able to answer. But I know not everybody is using UIDs. So there might be, instead of this UID, there might be /1. So if you try that at every different system, you might actually get a result for the wrong patient.
Is this?
I think you're stuck.
Is also coming to. Oh. Can you hear me?
Yeah, so you're cut up now. Yeah.
How about now?
Yes. Well, it's a bit jittery. It's in and out. Well, I can hear you, but your video is stuck. So maybe if you just keep talking. No. Edwin might have some internet troubles. Yeah, so there are several challenges there. How do these vendors know of each other? Which resources live where? Which of those vendors is going to issue an authorization credential for this use case? Are all of them doing it? I think that's pretty a pretty interesting challenge. Edwin found better internet.
I'm sorry about that. Am I good now, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's in Zorginzage, the talk is mainly about I want to only get data which is relevant for my role, which is kind of similar. Of course, here you're talking about different organizations at different places, but again, you're implementing some version of a role. It just does seem very hard to maintain. so the argument in favor of doing just indeed a relatively broad request and just getting back what you can get seems also logical to start from, at least, and then going more detailed with like not knowing who's or the application knowing who's a midwife or a gynecologist, etc. Could be a later step.
Yeah, so actually, when you were talking, Edwin, I thought of something else. So there is a discussion in various meetings about, okay, so like you said, whoever is fetching the data knows what to fetch. And of course, AO-Overdracht is a bit weird because it has this really narrow authorization. It says, oh, you can only request these specific resources. These resource paths, they are also listed in the composition that is used in AO-Overdracht. But I believe that the information standard also uses the relative paths for these resources. So for example, I could imagine that we could replace the entire resources section with a single identifier, like the composition unit or something, which is the scope of your authorization. And then
that's what we do.
Yeah, so then each FHIR server spread out over different vendors just have to check that single identifier and then match it to their own resources. And then the only thing those vendors have to agree upon is what is the identifier for this AO-Overdracht case for this patient.
And that's different than the purpose of use, which is currently.
Yeah, so the purpose of use is used to select the correct access policy. And
right,
then,
and
yeah, so the Zorgenzage access policy says, well, you have a patient, and within this, and this patient, of course, is a unique identifier which is known by every different vendor, so that's not a problem. And it says something like, yeah, with this role, you're allowed to fetch all this data. And you can do that for each different vendor, and then you in the user interface would just list it from the GP, I see this information, and from the pharmacy, I see this type of information, etc., etc. So if, for example, we could alter the AO-Overdracht authorizations to do sort of the same, but instead of using the patient identifier as the common ground, it should use the specific AO-Overdracht composition identifier or something like that as the common identifier. And then the different vendors, the resource owners, would have to know how that single identifier maps to the resources they have. And then the only challenge would be how to communicate that over different vendors.
Sorry, could you just highlight again the difference between the AO-Overdracht case and the Zorgenzage case?
Okay, so the main difference is this part. Yeah, so in Zorgenzage, it says instead of test service, it says something like Zorgenzage, or maybe even Zorgenzage medication, or something more specific.
Yes.
And you have a patient, right?
Yeah.
So this test service here that determines the access policy the resource servers have to enforce. And for all the other use cases, they will just say, okay, there needs to be a patient, and everything you do, every FHIR request you fire at us will be scoped to this patient, and maybe role if you add that to the access policy. In the AO-Overdracht, it says, okay, if this is an AO-Overdracht purpose of use, then you have to look into the specific resources, and only those resources may be requested. But these identifiers for resources, they are not unique. Well, this one is, but we know that the identifiers from vendors are not always UIDs. They might just be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc.
So in Overdracht, the subject of the page is just not used for requests, for data requests. Right?
No, because in the there are two messages in the design. One is the nurse handoff, which is the final transfer, but there's also a request message, and the request message is anonymous. There's no patient attached to it. You only get like the medical data, and then the question for each care organization that receives this is, can you give care to this specific case? And then one of them accepts it, and after acceptance, yes, then there is probably citizen service number is attached to it, and then there's less of a problem. But in the initial handoff request, there's a problem because you only have those identifiers. So we could say for the overdraft, there needs to be a case identifier, which might just be also encodable in the subject, because this is a URN, so we can do anything we want into this URN. We can also say, okay, this is the case subject, and we don't need those resources because they are also listed in the composition. And then actually all the systems that are going to retrieve the data will just try each vendor offering that data. But because there's a case identifier attached to it, they can filter those requests and say, we don't have anything. That would actually work, I think.
I would agree, yeah.
I can talk to this with Taco-Jan later today if he's at the INSIG meeting. Valerie, what do you think?
We didn't have another case of use of such verifiable credentials instead of overdraft. So I can't say that I have any opinion about how it should be implemented to meet all the use cases for now. So I will see what decision will be made, and I will. Well, I want also to hear this use case from Taco, because I don't actually remember. Maybe it was on another meeting, or maybe I just missed something, but I don't remember the use case description from Taco. I would be happy to hear it. Well, to have more context.
Yeah.
Yeah. But now I don't have anything to say about how it should be implemented.
Yeah, because I think if you look into let's say there will be a overdracht where both NADAP and Geremedica are responsible for offering the data.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, NADAP has the patient data, and you guys have the more medical data.
Yeah.
Then, for example, NADAP and Geremedica have to communicate this case identifier.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be interesting to know how that flow would be, and if we have to incorporate that into the overdracht standard. Because multiple vendors will probably have the same problem if this is going to be implemented. And it's actually very funny that we might have the ability to talk about that this afternoon, because the current NICTIS information standard assumes that there's a single system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a single vendor per a vendor per organization. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, being able to support best of breed would be good for the entire market. So, okay, but Edwin, thank you for your rubber ducking, because using a case identifier might just solve it for the overdraft case, and maybe even multiple cases as well.
Yeah,
that identifier has to be issued out of band between the systems.
Yeah, because as far as I remember, Taco well, and teacher from our side were well, most concerned about the functional issues. Well, that's as we mentioned on the brainstorm meeting. So yeah, but about this, it's also something to discuss probably. So yeah.
Yep. Okay. Given the time, I think there's two things to do. So hopefully I can get a chat with Takoyan this afternoon, and then we have his technical issue addressed, or at least we have some sort of way to solving it. And on the other part, we can create more in-depth designs of this proposed solution, so you guys can maybe get a better feeling what it will mean for you as a vendor.
Yeah, thank you. That would be nice.
Cool. Does anybody have any last questions?
Well, I think so. We've defined kind of the scope for the MVP would be to use the Kafka credential, right, and to make that's create a logical identifier, and we have to create a supporting software. For
so what we even can do for, I don't know, and maybe a hacking session or whatever, is that we can extend the organization credential with a logical identifier.
Okay.
And then the organization can choose its own identifier, and the vendor will add that to the organization credential. That will be the first hacky-wacky session, which totally depends on vendor-to-vendor trust. And of course,
that's clear.
Yeah. The next step would be, okay, we can already create one using the IRMA Kafka credential, because we have that code already. It was created over a year ago. But there's also this LSZA project getting off the ground now, and it's a bit, we don't know how fast that will go. If you talk to Harry Gozens, who's from the LSZA, he wants to start yesterday, but it's a political organization, so we never know. On the other hand, the KICV program from Zorginstituut is also pushing on getting those credentials. So we have to see what happens first. Whatever we have to do, we have to create those initial designs, see what the impact is on the API, and we have to adapt the internal structure on how DIDs can be linked together using logical identifiers. And also there's a bit of trust work there as well. So before we actually define the different credentials and how we're going to get them, we still have a lot of internal work to do. And that time might give us answer on the direction of the LSZA. Otherwise, we'll just go ahead and implement the Kafka credential.
Okay. I know it's hard to say with these organizations, but do you have an idea when LSZA will become more clearly defined project?
No. So what Harry said was, yeah, I want to outsource it. Just give an assignment to a company, and they will just build it, and then we're done. If you guys have the correct design, so we already have an OpenID Connect verifiable credential issuance flow designed yesterday, so should be fairly easy to just connect to a open source OAuth server, and then if you have some hackers, you could be done in a few weeks. But Harry said, okay, I want to outsource it, but my own people, they always have to look at it, and they might want to create something of their own. So there you see, okay, so at least he has 1 month of internal struggles.
Yeah, that's definitely not a quick process.
Yeah, we could also say that we could support both, which means that you're not able to use Kafka credential and LSZA credential at the same time. So if an organization switches to LSZA, he has to re-sign or reissue the LSZA credential to each of its vendors, and then it's okay. Then they will be equal.
So in this flow, would the the screens, let's say, where a organization proves their identity, would that be part of that score, or would that of the node? Sorry, or would we, if every vendor have to implement their own version of it?
Yeah, so what we'll probably do is for the Kafka credential, Irma Kafka credential, we'll add some screens and codes, or I think to our demo EHR. So that will just get an extra screen where we have the correct Irma flow in JavaScript, and then everybody can just copy paste that into their own application. For the LSZA credential, it will probably only be a button. So you only have to say start authorizing, because then whoever is capable of signing will be redirected to the LSZA. There they will log in with e-herkenning. There they will have to press a button that says, okay, now I want to authorize, for example, Hink. And then they're done. And then the flow goes back to your application. So that's a typical OAuth flow.
Nice.
That would be easier for vendors and everybody. It will probably involve a registration at the LSZA for you as a vendor.
Yeah. All right. Okay. What do you think is the best next step for this work group, Wout?
I think the next step would be getting some more in-depth designs. I think that's up to the technical team, so we can show what the impact would be for you as a vendor.
Okay.
And from there, we have to see what all the impact on our code will be and how that would fit into roadmap. And then maybe we can say something about how long it will take and in which version it will be released. It would involve updating the JSON LA context for sure. So luckily that's configurable, so that's not really a big problem. And we have to be really careful about backwards compatibility in JSON LA context, because if you do that wrong, all the signatures of the current credentials are invalid. But that's a technical detail. Just okay. Yeah, so it will take some time. Right now, my vacation is coming up for next week.
Yeah.
Yes, and after that we have to see how it fits into our schedule. We'll probably talk with the technical team after my vacation. So there are more things that need to be done. So we have a general roadmap, but we need to split this into epic features and see how much time it's going to take, and then it would be clearer on how much time it will actually take.
Okay. Is it the idea that we schedule maybe already a meeting for 3 weeks from now to just catch up with this work group, see how far you've been, and if we can help direct scope or even aid the process? Yeah.
Let's see. So if we do skip, we could do the 16th, same time.
Yeah, works for us.
Okay. Stop share. I'll also stop the video recording.